this lesson, we'll discuss how to use the pen tool to create animations, alter the duration of an animation, make elements appear and disappear on the stage, create a scale animation, create a fade, work with timeline options, zoom in and out on the timeline, replace images, copy and paste animations, and use easings. Although we've already discussed and used keyframes a few times in this course thus far, they are so important to using Edge Animate that we should take a minute to review them again before going any further. Keyframes appear as diamonds in the Properties panel on the timeline. Each keyframe marks a point in time where there is a change in the element's property. In the last lesson, we animated a rotation. We had two keyframes. The first keyframe was the beginning point of the rotation. Then we moved the playhead forward to a different location, then rotated the object. Since there was a change in the element's properties, which was it being rotated, another keyframe was added. In all animation that you create in Edge Animate, you'll at least need two keyframes. You'll need a beginning and ending keyframe. Animation that appears between two keyframes is represented by a colored bar between those frames. The pen tool is used to create from and to keyframes with a single edit. In other words, you can create beginning and ending keyframes by simply editing a property of an element. The pen tool is located in the timeline panel. The advantage of the pen tool is that you don't have to move the playhead around as we did when we created animation and motion earlier in this course. You only have to move it once. The pen tool will create the source, or beginning keyframe for you, as you create the destination, which is the ending keyframe. Let's learn how this works. Here you can see the elements on the stage. We want to animate these elements. We want them to move in toward each other from opposite sides of the stage. To do this, we click on the pen tool in the timeline panel. Note that when we do this, a little blue pin appears above the playhead in the timeline. We're going to click, then drag the blue pin to the 001 mark. The blue bar at the top of the timeline lets us know that Edge will create an animation that ends at the 001 mark. Now we click and drag to move the element off of the left side of the screen. You can click Shift Drag to make sure that it moves in a straight line. If we look at the timeline, we can see that Edge has automatically created the properties. The animation starts with the element off the stage. The element moves on the stage as the animation plays. The animation reaches its original location when the playhead gets to 001. Now let's use Shift Drag to move the other element off the right side of the stage. If we look at the timeline, we can see that we have two animated elements. Click the play button in the timeline panel to preview the animation. Now we can change other properties for our elements. This will add more animation to the elements as they move onto the stage. For example, we could change the opacity properties for the elements by following these steps. Move the playhead back to 000, make sure the pen tool is still activated, and then use Shift-click to select both elements. Go to the Properties panel and adjust the opacity slider. The value that you set it to will be the beginning opacity value. The ending opacity value will be the original opacity value of the elements. We talked about altering the duration of an animation earlier in this course when we talked about adding motion. However, being able to alter the duration of animation will be critical to successfully working with Edge Animate. For that reason, we're going to cover it again. In the timeline, we can see all our animations marked by keyframes. Each animation has a bar that appears between the beginning and ending keyframe. To shorten the length of a duration, drag the ending keyframe in toward the beginning keyframe. To add time to an animation, drag the keyframes further apart. If you want to add an exact amount of time to an animation, there's an easier way to do that than dragging keyframes. Move the playhead so it's where you want to add additional time. This should be somewhere between two keyframes. Now go to Timeline, Insert Time. Specify the amount of time that you want to add to the composition. In our case, we want to add 2 seconds. Click Insert Time. Remember, inserting time will slow down the animation. By turning the display property off and on for an element, you can make an element invisible or make it appear. If the display property is on, the element is visible. If it's off, the element is invisible. Here's how to do it. Select the element on the stage. We're going to move our playhead to 000. We want the orange circle to be visible at the beginning of the composition. Now go to the Properties panel. Click the keyframe, or the diamond, next to the display property. By default, it says Always On, but when you click the keyframe, it'll say On. Now move the playhead to the location where you want the element to become invisible. Go back to the Properties panel and click to display the drop-down menu for the display property by clicking the triangle. Select Off from the drop-down menu. Now you can scrub through your animation to see how it appears and disappears. You can animate an element so that it gets smaller as the composition plays by adjusting the scale properties. Remember, the scale is a percentage of an object's original size. To adjust the scale properties, we'll use the Pen tool as well as the Transform tool. We're going to make the circle in our composition grow smaller. We're going to start by moving the playhead to 0, 0, 0, then clicking the Pen tool in the Timeline panel. Next, drag the playhead to 0, 0, 2. Notice that we left the blue pin in place at the beginning. Make sure the element is selected on the stage and then click on the Transform tool in the Tools panel. Using the handles on the bounding box, shrink the size of the element. Shift Option will make the circle resize evenly. Press play to preview the animation. You can also make an object grow larger and smaller by using keyframes and the height and width properties for the element. To change the point of transformation, move the crosshairs that appear in the center of the element just as you did when we moved the point of rotation. When you create a fade, you make an element slowly appear or disappear on the screen. You create a fade by going to the opacity property for an element in the Properties panel and adding a keyframe. Once you've added the first keyframe, you drag the playhead to the location where you want the ending keyframe. Then adjust the opacity level using the slider. Notice that we've selected the circle using the Selection tool. We've also moved our playhead to 0, 0, 0. Let's go to the Properties panel. Since we want to make our planet fade into view instead of out of view, we're first going to adjust the opacity slider to 0%. Now click the diamond by the opacity slider to add the beginning keyframe. Going back to the Timeline panel, we're going to move the playhead to 0, 0, 2. To make the element fully visible at this point in the composition, we then go back to the Properties panel again and adjust the opacity slider to 100%. The ending keyframe is added. Press play to preview the animation.